I had spent the better part of my adult life working toward one goal: freedom. Not the kind of freedom politicians shout about on podiums or the kind your boss promises with flexible hours and Zoom calls. I mean the real kind. The kind that lets you wake up when you want fish in your own lake and camp under the stars without asking for anyone's permission. That kind of freedom doesn't come cheap. It took me 15 years, 5 broken ribs, and 2 bankrupt businesses to earn it. But I finally got there. It was a late spring evening when I returned to my ranch after a year abroad. I had leased it to a trusted friend while I traveled across South America studying ancient irrigation methods and living without phones. I came back older, tougher, and clearer than I had ever been. But nothing could have prepared me for what had happened while I was gone. My property had always been massive. 1,200 acres of mixed forest and meadow bordered on the west by a private lake that stretched for over a mile. My grandfather bought the original parcel back in the 1950s, and we added to it every generation. It wasn't just land. It was legacy. It was where I learned to shoot, fish, ride, and survive. As I pulled up the gravel road toward the house, I noticed something strange. A wooden sign near the fence post read Lakewood Residential Community, Private HOA Property, Members Only. I stopped my truck midway down the path, engine still humming. I stepped out and walked toward it, squinting under the lowering sun. The sign looked newly installed. The bolts were still shiny. The message wasn't just strange. It was completely wrong. I own this land. All of it. After 20 minutes of driving past unfamiliar gates, cheap security cameras, and weirdly uniform landscaping, I pulled up to my house. My house looked mostly untouched, but the land around it had changed. New trails. Plastic flags in the soil. Little HOA lawn signs that weren't there a year ago. Something was wrong. Inside, I found my friend Travis packing his things. He looked embarrassed. I barely got 2 words out before he started explaining. I tried, man. I fought them for months. They just kept coming. The HOA bought land bordering the North Ridge and started expanding like a fungus. They claimed your lake had been annexed as a recreational resource. They said you'd been unreachable for over 6 months, so they assumed it was abandoned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They what? Travis rubbed the back of his neck and handed me a thick envelope. They even got some kind of provisional access rights from the county office. Temporary lease based on public maintenance claims. I tried calling you. Letters. Everything. You were off-grid. So in the time I was away chasing freedom, the neighborhood I had always avoided had grown its tentacles deep into my land. They had claimed my lake. My lake. That night I walked the whole shoreline with a flashlight and an old boundary map my grandfather had drawn by hand. Every post, every flag, every so-called HOA improvement fell within the property lines I still legally owned. They hadn't just made a mistake. They had trespassed, built structures on my land, installed signs like they were the ones in charge. The next morning I drove into town and paid a visit to the county registrar. After 2 hours of paperwork and cross-referencing archived surveys, they confirmed what I already knew. Every inch of that lake was mine. I even had the water rights deeded back in 1984. What the HOA had done wasn't just aggressive. It was illegal. But I didn't want revenge. Not yet. I wanted to do the one thing I had looked forward to for years. Camp by my own lake. Fish under my own stars. Feel the wind without hearing a neighbor cough from their porch. So I did. I set up camp that night. Old canvas tent. Fishing gear. Whiskey. No phone. No internet. Just the crackle of fire and the call of the loons drifting over the water. And for one night it was perfect. Until the flashing red and blue lights showed up just after midnight. Sir, you are trespassing on HOA property. We received a call about an armed man squatting near the lake. 2 deputies stood behind the beams of their squad car headlights, hands near their belts. I laughed and held up my ID. This is my property. Check the registry. They didn't believe me. Not until I produced the papers. Not until I showed them the original hand-drawn map and the notarized documents. Even then they seemed skeptical. Like the very idea that a man could still own his own lake confused them. But that wasn't the worst part. Sir, we're going to need you to come down to the station. There's a formal complaint. The HOA president filed an emergency order against you, claiming you're disturbing the peace and threatening homeowners. That was it. I went from camper to criminal in the span of 2 hours, all because I had decided to spend one night under the stars on my own land. The HOA had called the police on me. They had reported me for illegal camping on a lake they didn't even own. I didn't argue. I knew better than to get into a fight on a dark shoreline with 2 confused cops and a folder full of documents. But I promised myself something that night. This wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. It was going to be war. When I got out the next morning, I drove straight to my lawyer. Abigail Monroe was the kind of attorney who had framed court orders hung on her wall like hunting trophies. She listened silently as I told her everything. By the end she was already filing boundary violations, property seizure, and false reports to law enforcement. That's a hell of a start. They're lucky you're not pressing charges for harassment yet. But I wasn't in a rush. I wanted every piece of this to fall apart publicly and completely. I wanted to know how deep this went. How an HOA got county support without a single notice to me. Who signed what and why no one checked the actual ownership of the lake. The next step was simple. Go to the HOA meeting. I showed up that Friday night wearing the same muddy boots from my lakeside camp. The room smelled like burnt coffee and smug entitlement. Half a dozen middle-aged homeowners stared at me like I had tracked manure onto their new rugs. At the head of the table was a woman in a floral blouse and a pin that read President, Lakewood Community Association. Her name was Deborah Lane. "You're not on the agenda," she said without looking up. "Neither was your trespass on my property," I replied and laid the deed on the table. That was the first time I saw her blink. The rest of the board shuffled nervously. A man in a golf pullover started saying something about easements and community benefit, but I cut him off. "You built on my land. Installed signs. Called the cops on me. Now I want to know who signed off on it." No one spoke. Deborah cleared her throat and finally looked at me. "We were given county guidance. There was confusion about the boundary. Confusion doesn't give you the right to put a dock on my lake." She straightened up. "The dock was built for safety. We had incidents with children and those children were trespassing." Silence again. That's when I dropped the second envelope. Inside were photos of every illegal structure, every sign, and every piece of trash left behind by their so-called community. Abigail had already drafted a cease and desist. They thought I'd leave it at that. A letter. A warning. But I wasn't done. I planned to reclaim every inch of that lake, not just on paper but in front of every smug neighbor who had voted to turn my land into their weekend playground. They thought I was a hermit. They didn't know I had spent 15 years fighting to own that lake. Now they were going to find out what happened when you tried to steal a man's freedom. And I was just getting started. The morning after that HOA meeting, I stood on the edge of my lake with a pair of binoculars in one hand and a steaming mug of black coffee in the other. Fog drifted low across the water while the reflection of the rising sun shimmered on the surface. From where I stood I could see the unauthorized dock stretching over my shoreline like a bony finger pointing in defiance. The chairs. The signs. Even a metal rack where someone had left rental kayaks. I didn't say a word. I just watched. Because I knew something they didn't. While the HOA thought I would come in guns blazing with lawsuits and court orders, I chose a different route. Exposure. I wasn't just going to reclaim my land quietly. I was going to pull the mask off their entire operation. Publicly. Fully. No chance to recover. Abigail and I had already begun gathering everything we needed. I had maps, survey records, land deeds, and notarized boundary certificates. But what we needed now was proof that the HOA didn't just make a mistake. They made a choice. A choice to take what didn't belong to them. A choice to lie to county officials. A choice to turn my private lake into a source of profit. And I was going to prove it. First I called Travis. He owed me nothing, but he was angry about what had happened while I was gone. He told me everything. While he lived here, the HOA had sent letters threatening fines for not maintaining common areas near the lake even though the area wasn't part of their jurisdiction. They installed motion lights. They invited contractors to build benches and signs. They held a summer members-only barbecue by the water. That was the first threat. Next I reached out to a local drone hobbyist named Benny who lived a few miles south. Benny liked cash and didn't ask too many questions. He flew over the lake every morning and night for the next 3 days. What we found made me grit my teeth. The HOA had installed trail cameras. Not wildlife cams. Surveillance-grade cameras pointed directly at the water and surrounding trees. Not only that, but they had begun draining part of the shoreline to lay some kind of concrete base for what looked like another dock or possibly a floating gazebo. They were expanding. They weren't stopping. Even after I showed up at their meeting. Even after the cease and desist. They were treating this like a bluff. So I gave them a reason to stop. It started with signs. Real ones. Laminated property notices posted at regular intervals all around the lake, complete with parcel ID numbers, water rights references, and a printed warning that all unauthorized structures and occupants would be reported as trespassers under state code. I installed them myself. Day and night. In clear view of every camera. Then I brought in the land surveyors. Abigail arranged for an official team to mark and flag every foot of the real boundary with bright orange posts and ribbons. The moment those posts went up, people started to notice. I saw neighbors stopping in their tracks, walking dogs along the trails, only to realize the land they thought was theirs was very much not. One woman called out to me from across the trees. "You can't just put up signs. This is shared space." I didn't even bother to reply. The following day I was served a notice. Apparently the HOA was suing me for interfering with community enjoyment of shared amenities. I laughed when I read it. A half-page letter printed on cheap stock filled with empty threats and legal jargon that made no sense. But it told me one thing. They were scared. Abigail confirmed it. They've overplayed their hand. They got so used to nobody pushing back that they started thinking they were untouchable. Now they're desperate. So we pushed harder. We filed our own claim. Trespassing, unlawful use of private resources, willful misrepresentation of property access, and malicious reporting to law enforcement. We attached photos, videos, and a 36-page report showing every documented instance of the HOA using or profiting from my land without permission. But that was only the beginning. While Abigail filed in court, I launched the second part of my plan. Public exposure. I called in a favor from an old friend who worked at the local news station. I gave him the story straight. How I left to live off-grid and returned to find a neighborhood HOA had not only trespassed on my property but tried to take legal action against me for reclaiming it. He loved it. Within days the story ran across local media. Man returns from South America to find private lake overtaken by HOA. Interviews. Footage. Maps. Even a slow-motion clip of HOA board members smiling while standing near the dock on what the news labeled clearly private land. That news clip went viral. Within 72 hours I had people from across the state reaching out. Property owners sharing horror stories about their own HOA nightmares. Lawyers offering advice. Real estate experts weighing in on how often HOAs push beyond their legal limits and get away with it. And suddenly I wasn't alone. The pressure started to mount. County officials who had previously brushed us off now wanted to meet. The sheriff's office sent an apology and clarification statement admitting the deputies had acted without full knowledge of the property lines. One of the HOA board members quietly resigned. But Deborah Lane, the president, didn't back down. She doubled down. She sent me a personal letter. "Your behavior is disruptive. Your attitude is toxic. You are creating division in a peaceful community, and we will pursue every legal option to stop your interference." I framed it and hung it on the side of my cabin, because it meant she was losing control. But I wasn't done. I wanted to know how they had gotten approval to build anything near my lake in the first place. Who gave them the green light? So I went to the zoning office and started digging. It didn't take long. The permits they filed were vague. They didn't include parcel IDs. They didn't reference land surveys. One of them simply listed the project site as Community Greenbelt Area. And somehow it got approved. That's when I found out why. The zoning clerk was married to one of the HOA board members. I filed a complaint that afternoon. Conflict of interest. Abuse of position. Tampering with land use records. By the end of the week the county launched a formal audit. Meanwhile I kept doing what I loved. Camping by the lake. Fishing. Living free. And every time someone from the HOA tried to interrupt me I recorded it. Every threat, every insult, every visit. All documented. All backed by proof. They wanted me gone. But this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every person who ever got pushed off their own land. Every rancher who woke up to a fine for building a fence. Every homeowner forced to paint their door a different color or tear down a flag. This was bigger than a lake. This was about ownership. And they were going to learn what it meant when someone fought back. The turning point came 3 weeks later. Deborah Lane was arrested. Fraud. False filings. Tampering with zoning documents. When the county audit was complete they found a trail of altered records and emails between her and zoning officials confirming she had pushed through the dock permit using forged maps and references. The HOA board tried to downplay it. She acted alone. We had no idea. But nobody bought it. The community started turning on them. Homeowners who once defended the HOA began demanding resignations. Local journalists swarmed the neighborhood. Protest signs popped up on lawns. HOA meetings went from smug rituals to screaming matches. I watched it all from my porch with my feet up and a fishing rod in hand. By the end of the month 5 board members had stepped down. The HOA attorney resigned. Their insurance was canceled. And the dock? I tore it down myself. With the full blessing of the county and a news crew watching. The story wasn't over. But the war had turned. They took my land. So I took their power. And I wasn't done yet. The air felt different that morning. So heavy. The kind of morning where birds go quiet and the wind refuses to move. I stood barefoot on my dock, the one I rebuilt myself, with a cup of coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. Across the lake everything looked calm. But beneath the surface I knew something was shifting. The HOA had gone silent. After Deborah Lane's arrest, the board meetings stopped being public. The usual notices were gone. The HOA website went offline for maintenance. My cease and desist signs had all been torn down in the middle of the night. I replaced them each time with new ones stronger, waterproofed and mounted in concrete. They weren't giving up. They were regrouping. But what they didn't know was that I had already predicted their next move. See, when people like this get exposed, they don't retreat. They don't apologize. They try to bury the truth. Rewrite the narrative. Pretend it was all a misunderstanding and that you're the problem for pointing it out. So I beat them to it. I went public. Not just on local news. I called in every favor I had. My friend at the station connected me with an independent journalist who ran a national investigative podcast. She was sharp. Ruthless. She didn't care about playing nice. She wanted corruption, and this HOA scandal had layers. We met at my ranch and I told her everything. From the forged documents to the illegal construction, the arrest of their president, the false police report, the secret surveillance, everything. I showed her the maps, the emails, the footage. She spent 3 days interviewing witnesses and residents. Some of the HOA members even tried to intimidate her while she was in town. Bad idea. Her story hit the internet like a wildfire. Rancher returns to find private lake stolen by HOA, uncovers criminal web in quiet suburb. Over 4 million downloads in the first week. National news outlets picked it up next. That's when the letters started coming in. Dozens. Then hundreds. Ranchers, homeowners, small-town families all writing to say the same thing. This happened to us too. One woman from Colorado said her HOA fined her $3,000 for putting up a fence on land she inherited from her grandfather. A veteran from Texas said he was taken to court for parking his truck in his own driveway. A man in Nevada said his HOA drained his irrigation pond without permission and billed him for the landscaping. I started seeing the pattern. This wasn't just a rogue HOA. This was systemic. And I was going to bring it all to light. While the news cycle swarmed, the HOA tried to do damage control. They hired a PR firm. They released a public statement claiming Deborah acted without board knowledge. That they were committed to transparency and healing. They even tried offering to settle the lawsuit quietly. But I wasn't looking for a check. I wanted them exposed. So I held a public town meeting. At my lake. Hundreds of people showed up. Locals from my county, out-of-state reporters, angry property owners, even some county officials who had signed off on the illegal permits. I stood on a portable stage with a bullhorn, and behind me hung a giant printed map showing the real boundary lines of the property. I'm not here today just because they tried to take my land. I'm here because they thought I'd be quiet about it. The crowd roared. I went through every detail. What they did. How they did it. Why they thought they could get away with it. I played clips from the podcast and footage from drone flyovers showing just how deep the trespass went. And then I said it. This wasn't an accident. This was a hijacking. And it ends now. I launched the Lake Rights Project that day. A statewide effort to investigate and push back against overreaching HOAs using land seizure, intimidation, and fraudulent fines to harass property owners. Abigail helped set up the legal foundation. Donations poured in overnight. We built a volunteer network of surveyors, lawyers, and journalists. Meanwhile, the HOA crumbled from within. The interim president resigned a week after the town meeting. 3 more board members were caught in an email leak discussing ways to turn the narrative and pressure the sheriff's office to shut down the noise. I handed those emails to the media. By now, the state attorney general had taken notice. They opened an inquiry into multiple HOAs, including Lakewood. Subpoenas were issued. Records seized. Depositions taken. But the HOA wasn't finished. They filed a counterclaim against me. Accused me of defamation, harassment, and inciting unrest within a peaceful community. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so dangerous. Because they weren't trying to win in court. They were trying to scare me. They thought I'd break under the pressure. They didn't know I'd already survived worse than lawsuits. I'd built a business from nothing. Lost it. Built another. I'd broken bones working the same land they were trying to take. I'd faced storms, wildfires, lawsuits, and sabotage. And I'd always come back stronger. So I took their counterclaim and used it as fuel. Every time they attacked, I went louder. I printed their filings and passed them out at the next rally. I showed them on the news. I read them line by line online so the whole world could see what the HOA considered a threat telling the truth. That was their real fear. And the more I exposed them, the more the people turned on them. Lawsuits against the HOA started popping up across the state. Former board members were subpoenaed. One of them tried to flee to another state. Didn't work. The AG tracked him down and charged him with obstruction. But the most satisfying moment came quietly. On a calm Wednesday morning, I received a certified envelope. Inside was a statement from the county. The entire HOA charter for Lakewood had been dissolved. Their authority, their board, their enforcement powers, gone. Stripped by court order and state mandate. It was over. I walked back to the lake, stood at the edge, and let the silence settle around me. No more fake signs. No more illegal docks. No more HOA. Just my lake, my land, my rules. But I wasn't done. Because now I had a voice. And the world was listening. The wind was sharp the morning I got the call. Not the kind of cold that freezes your skin, but the kind that clears your thoughts. It was early, just after sunrise, and I was walking the trail around the lake that had started all of this. Every tree stump, every dock post now cleared or removed, every sign of that HOA's trespass now erased. But peace never lasts long when you go public. Abigail's voice was sharp over the phone. They're rewriting the documents. Refiling the permits. Someone's trying to alter the records again. I didn't ask how she knew. She had sources everywhere now. County offices had turned into battlegrounds. HOA sympathizers still sat behind a few desks pulling strings quietly, hoping no one would notice. But we noticed. What's the plan? I asked her. Exposure. Same as before. But this time we go federal. I ended the call and kept walking along the ridge line until I found the old cedar where my grandfather carved our family initials nearly 60 years ago. Right there I made a choice. I wasn't going to just clean up what they did. I was going to dig out the roots. The HOA was dead in name, but its influence was still buried in the system. Regulations, zoning codes, outdated permits, and crooked officials. And if they were going to try to rewrite history, I was going to print the truth on a wall so large the whole country could see it. The Lake Rights Project turned into something bigger. It became the Homeowner Justice Network. A full legal and investigative initiative operating across 3 states with pro bono attorneys, researchers, and property rights experts. People were coming forward in waves now. Farmers, ranchers, veterans, small business owners, even elderly couples from retirement communities all had stories. Stories of being fined for planting vegetables. Stories of being threatened for flying a flag. Stories of being told they didn't have the right to use the land they bought. We archived every one. Some HOAs panicked and started deleting their websites. Others tried denying they ever had enforcement power. But we had screenshots, recordings, and paper trails. We weren't just going after board members anymore. We were going after the network. The companies behind the HOAs. The private law firms that trained them. The real estate developers who built the lie into their neighborhoods from day one. The deeper we went, the darker it got. One community in Arizona had collected over $600,000 in fines in 1 year alone for things like garage color, mailbox height, and tree trimming violations. None of the money went toward repairs. All of it went to a private security firm owned by the board president's brother. We exposed them too. Every time we dropped a report, more news stations picked it up. The podcast team did follow-ups. Online forums exploded. We had politicians reaching out asking for interviews. Asking how they could help. Not all of them were sincere, but enough of them were. We turned the fight from one ranch to a movement. And then the HOA board members started turning on each other. It was only a matter of time. A former Lakewood board secretary reached out anonymously. She wanted to meet. I agreed. We sat across from each other in a diner 3 counties over. She looked tired, broken even. Years of secrets worn into her eyes like shadows that never left. I didn't know it would go that far, she said. At first it was just about neighborhood order. Clean lawns, quiet streets. Then it turned into this obsession. Deborah had connections and she used them. Said you were a threat. Said we had to act first before you sold the lake to developers. I leaned in. Why now? Because it's not just your lake. They've done this all over. I have copies. Real plans. A list of properties they were targeting. You weren't the first. She handed me a flash drive. That night Abigail and I reviewed everything. The files revealed a coordinated strategy. Identify absentee owners. Forge maintenance claims. File for provisional access through friendly contacts at the county. Slowly build structures. Then justify control through safety policies and member votes. It wasn't just fraud. It was organized land theft. And I was the proof it could be stopped. The next morning I uploaded the files publicly with a full write-up. Everything redacted to protect the source but clear enough to make it undeniable. The story hit national headlines within hours. HOA network exposed in multi-state land seizure scheme. The backlash was brutal for them. Lawsuits, criminal charges. State agencies flooded with complaints. County offices raided. A dozen resignations across different towns. And all of it traced back to the same corrupt blueprint. But it still wasn't enough for me. Because deep down I knew one thing. They still thought I'd fade out once the noise settled. They still believed people like me would eventually give up. But I had already buried too many good men on bad land to ever stop now. So I went one step further. I invited lawmakers to my ranch. Senators. State reps. Policy directors. Not all of them accepted, but enough did. I showed them the boundary lines, the footage, the lakeside camp where it all started. I told them the full story in my own words with no edits and no spin. And then I told them what I wanted. Real reform. End the HOA monopoly on community enforcement. Mandate third-party oversight. Require landowner opt-in for all expansions. Create a federal hotline for reporting HOA overreach. And most of all, enforce retroactive restitution for any family that lost land under false legal action. They listened. Not all. But enough. 2 months later, a bill was introduced in state legislature. The Homeowner Protection Act. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. For the first time in decades, someone had stood on their own land and told the system no, and the system had to listen. But not everyone wanted change. That night someone tried to burn down my equipment shed. I caught them on camera. Masked, gloved, fast. They threw a Molotov through the window and ran. The fire took the west wall and a riding mower, but nothing else. Sheriff's office showed up in full force. Everyone knew who was behind it, even if we couldn't name the person yet. That was the final sign. This wasn't just pushback. It was war. And I was ready. I replaced the shed. Reinforced everything. Installed security. Trained locals in how to read deeds and report violations. I wasn't going to be a victim. I was going to be the example. They tried to rewrite history. But I handed the truth to the world and let it write a new future. It was dawn when I walked the ridge again. The same ridge where I stood the day I returned from South America. That day the wind was mocking and the signs around my lake felt like a cage. Now the signs were mine. The land was mine. The silence was no longer filled with fear or violation. It was peace. Earned peace. But the war wasn't just won by force. It was won by truth. 6 months had passed since the last board member stepped down. Lakewood was gone. Not just disbanded. Not just dissolved. It was gutted. Every one of their so-called regulations was nullified. Their accounts were frozen. Their leadership under investigation. And the land they tried to control had all been returned to rightful owners. Including mine. The Homeowner Protection Act passed in 2 states. 3 more were reviewing it. Federal hearings were being held with testimony from victims across the country. And every one of them had watched my story. Listened to the podcast. Read the headlines. They knew if it happened to me, it could happen to anyone. But the ending wasn't just about survival. It was about victory. And ownership. A month after the final county audit closed, I got a letter. It was short and to the point. One of the real estate developers who helped start the Lakewood HOA had gone bankrupt. His company had collapsed under scrutiny. The remaining assets, including the development office warehouse and 8 open parcels surrounding the old HOA zone, were going up for auction. No one was bidding. Everyone was scared of being associated with the scandal. Except me. I bought it all. Every parcel, every office, every lot. The same office where they had planned to carve trails through my land. The same warehouse where they had stored illegal signs and fake community newsletters. The same parcels they tried to rezone in their favor. All mine. Legally, fully, and publicly. I turned the HOA's old office into a community land rights center. Free education for homeowners, legal clinics, map analysis, and document training. The warehouse became a training ground for new investigators and interns from the universities who wanted to work in property law. The lots were converted into campsites open to veterans, farmers, and ranchers needing a break from the system. And I didn't charge a single dollar for any of it. Because this wasn't about profit. It was about legacy. What they tried to take was more than land. It was independence, generational trust, a way of life, and I made sure they would never touch it again. I also released the final full report. Over 400 pages detailing every abuse committed by Lakewood HOA. The fake permits, the forged signatures, the backdoor deals, the false police reports, the surveillance, the intimidation tactics, the trespassing, the lies. Every word verified. Every page signed and sealed. The report went to every state legislature. Every local county board. Every real estate commission. I made sure no one could claim they didn't know. And I didn't stop there. I created a network across the country. 45 landowners trained as field operatives traveling county by county helping others fight back. Every one of them had a story. A man whose orchard had been fenced off. A mother fined $10,000 for her kids building a lemonade stand. A Vietnam vet who nearly lost his ranch over a shed built 3 inches outside the HOA-approved zone. They joined because they believed in what I believed. That ownership means something. That land cannot be controlled by committees hiding behind titles and bylaws. That no man should fear walking his own property. And then I got the final call. Deborah Lane was convicted. 3 years prison time. Plus restitution. She would be required to personally compensate every victim whose land she had falsely regulated or whose finances had been harmed by her orders. Her assets were frozen and her license revoked. She wouldn't be running anything again. The courtroom was full that day. I was there. She didn't look at me when they read the sentence. But I looked at her. Not out of hate. Not even out of anger anymore. I looked because I wanted her to know something. You tried to take my lake. You tried to erase my rights. You called the cops on me for camping where my grandfather taught me to fish. You thought you owned what I built. But you forgot one thing. I never left. I never gave up. I never sold out. And now I own every inch of what you tried to steal. It wasn't just about fighting back. It was about standing so firm that the entire system had to change just to deal with you. It was about taking the worst thing that happened to me and turning it into a cause that would outlive me. That night I walked down to the water. Same campfire spot where it all began. The trees whispered. The lake shimmered. The same place where they once sent police to drag me off now stood quiet and free. I poured a little bourbon into the soil. For my grandfather. For the friends I lost. For every person who had ever stood alone against a lie dressed in paperwork. And I said the only words that mattered. This is mine. And it always will be. If this story hit home, and you're tired of HOAs crossing the line, then like the video, share it, and subscribe to HOA Confidential, where the truth gets louder, and the silence ends.